They say dignity doesn't pay the bills. But for Claire Thompson, it was the only thing she had left. The divorce had stripped her of nearly everything: the house, the car, even the friends who had quietly chosen sides. At 36, she found herself back in a two-bedroom apartment with peeling wallpaper and a fridge that rattled louder than her children's laughter. And yet, every morning, she laced up the same pair of scuffed sneakers, tucked her hair into a tidy bun, and went to work at the local grocery store. Stocking shelves. Bagging groceries. Smiling at customers who didn't care enough to look her in the eye. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what she'd once dreamed of when she and Daniel, her ex-husband, were young and playing house with borrowed furniture and impossible plans. Back then, he had promised her the world. Now, he had given the world to someone else. Still, Claire refused to crumble. She couldn't afford to. Her two children, Ella, age 9, and Max, 6, needed her steady. Needed her strong. And so she pushed carts through crowded aisles and clocked in double shifts, convincing herself that survival was its own form of victory. The town was small, the kind where whispers travel faster than cars. People noticed when she went from being Daniel's wife, the woman with the perfect smile at the country club, to the tired cashier with aching feet and an apron smeared with produce dust. Some pitied her. Others smirked. Claire learned to ignore them all. But even the thickest skin can bruise. The nights were hardest. After the children were asleep, she'd sit at the kitchen table beneath the yellow glow of a flickering bulb, balancing bills against her paycheck. Rent, groceries, school supplies. There was never enough. Yet she found small ways to soften the edges: a surprise ice cream cone for Ella, a second-hand toy truck for Max. They never saw how tight things were. She made sure of it. Still, the loneliness clung to her like a damp coat. Divorce had taken more than her marriage, it had stolen her sense of place. Once she'd been half of a couple, part of a family picture. Now she was just Claire, the cashier at Miller's Market. And if she was honest with herself, the shame stung more than the struggle. Not because she looked down on the work, honest labor was nothing to be ashamed of, but because she knew exactly what Daniel would say if he ever saw her behind that register. He had always been cruel in quiet ways, the kind of man who dressed up insults as jokes, who measured worth in dollar signs and status symbols. She hadn't seen him in months, not since the divorce papers were signed and he drove away in his new car with his new woman. She had prayed it would stay that way. But life has a way of testing the wounds we try hardest to cover. On a gray Thursday morning, the kind where clouds sit low and heavy like unspoken secrets, Claire woke with a knot in her stomach. Something told her the day would not be kind. She brushed it off, tied her apron, and walked the few blocks to Miller's Market. By noon, she was kneeling in aisle 4, sliding cans of soup into neat rows, when she heard a laugh that stopped her cold. Deep, familiar. A sound that once belonged to late-night talks and morning coffee. Now it belonged to someone she wished she could forget. Daniel. The air seemed to thicken as she looked up. There he was, leaning against a cart, his arm draped casually around a woman half her age. Tiffany, all glossy hair, sharp perfume, and a diamond bracelet that sparkled louder than her laugh. Claire's pulse quickened. She turned back to the shelf, praying they'd walk past. Praying he wouldn't see her crouched on the floor in a red apron that screamed employee. But fate, as always, has its own cruel timing. His eyes found her. And with that smirk she knew too well, the one that had once charmed and then destroyed her, Daniel tilted his head and said just loud enough to carry. Well, well. Look at this. Claire froze, a can of chicken noodle soup trembling in her hand. Claire heard the voice before she saw him. That smooth, low tone that once made her feel safe now dripped with arrogance, curling around her name like smoke. Claire? She froze, soup can in hand, heart thudding. She didn't need to turn, her body already knew. Still, she did, slowly, bracing herself. There he was. Daniel. Sharp as ever in a gray tailored suit, his dark hair neatly styled, a sheen of expensive cologne surrounding him. He looked every inch the man he wanted the world to believe he was: successful, charming, untouchable. But Claire knew better. She had seen the shadows behind that polished exterior, the cruelty tucked neatly beneath his smile. And then, beside him, Tiffany. Younger. Slim. With long brown hair swept into glamorous waves and lips painted a shade of red that demanded attention. Her crimson dress clung to her like she belonged on a magazine cover. She leaned on Daniel's arm, laughing softly as if the two had just stepped out of a movie scene rather than a grocery aisle. Claire's stomach tightened. "Oh, wow," Daniel said, his lips curving into a smirk. "Didn't expect to run into you here." He let the pause hang, his gaze sliding down to the apron tied around her waist, the name tag that gleamed under the harsh store lights. "Although, I guess it makes sense. This is where you work now?" Tiffany giggled, resting her manicured fingers on Daniel's sleeve. "Oh my gosh," she whispered, but loud enough for Claire to hear, "she's really working here." Her eyes glittered with mockery. "That's so, what's the word?" "Inspirational." She tilted her head, lips curling. Like one of those single mom survival movies where the heroine learns the value of hard work. The laugh that followed sliced through the air like broken glass. Claire felt heat rise up her neck, but she kept her face still. She had learned, over time, how to wear calm like armor. She placed the soup can on the shelf, fingers steady even though her chest ached. "People shop here every day," she said quietly. "Including you." Daniel chuckled, that low condescending sound she remembered from too many arguments behind closed doors. "Oh, I didn't mean as a customer." "No, Claire. I just never thought you'd end up here. Stocking shelves. Bagging groceries." He gestured broadly to the aisle, like he was a judge presenting evidence to a courtroom. "Remember when I said you'd never make it without me? Hate to say it, but looks like I was right." The words landed like stones in her stomach. Nearby, a young mother with two toddlers slowed her cart, pretending to compare cereal boxes while sneaking glances at the scene. A man in a baseball cap kept his eyes glued to the freezer section, clearly listening but unwilling to get involved. Claire felt them all, the silent witnesses to her humiliation. Her throat burned. She remembered the night Daniel had left, the door slamming, his final words still etched into her bones: "You'll crawl back. You can't survive without me." And yet, she had survived. Every late bill, every double shift, every night crying quietly in the bathroom while her son slept, she had carried it all. Now, standing in front of him, she realized he didn't see that strength. He only saw what he wanted: her apron, her struggle, her failure. Tiffany leaned closer to Daniel, her perfume mingling with his cologne. "She's so noble," she mocked, eyes sparkling with cruelty. "Honestly, it's kind of cute. Like, at least she's not giving up, right?" Claire's palms stung where her nails dug in. She wanted to say something sharp, something that would slice through their smug laughter. But instead, she breathed deeply, her voice calm when she finally answered. "Better to stock shelves," she said, "than to be empty inside." The words weren't loud, but they cut. Daniel's smirk faltered just for a second, his eyes narrowing. Tiffany blinked, her lips parting before she quickly covered it with another laugh, louder this time, as though to fill the silence. "You hear that, babe?" she nudged Daniel. "She's poetic now." Daniel recovered, straightening his jacket. He glanced at Claire one last time, his expression dripping superiority. Try not to scuff the floors, Claire. Wouldn't want you to lose this prestigious position. With that, he pushed the cart forward, Tiffany at his side, her laugh echoing down the aisle until they disappeared. The moment they were gone, Claire let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The air felt heavy again, thick with fluorescent light and the low hum of refrigerators. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for another can, aligning it neatly on the shelf. It was muscle memory now: stock, straighten, smile. Survive. But beneath her practiced calm, something sharp burned in her chest. He wanted to break her again. He wanted her to shrink, to bow her head, to prove him right. But she wouldn't. She lifted her chin, eyes fixed straight ahead, and thought fiercely, "This is not the end of my story. Not yet." She adjusted her apron and pushed the cart forward, ignoring the curious eyes still following her. She refused to give Daniel the satisfaction of watching her crumble. The humiliation stung, yes. But under that sting was something else, something steadier. A quiet, defiant strength she had carried all along, even when no one noticed. And one day soon, she knew, the tables would turn. Claire had promised herself that morning that she wouldn't flinch anymore, not at the whispers, not at the sideways glances. She was stronger than she had been months ago. Stronger than the broken woman who once sobbed herself to sleep after Daniel left. Still, strength is tested in fire. And that fire arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening, during the after-work rush at the store. The line at her register stretched long, people restless with groceries piled high in carts. Claire was steady, her apron tied tight, her hands moving in rhythm. Scan, bag, smile, repeat. Then she heard a laugh she knew too well. It wasn't just a laugh, it was sharp, deliberate, designed to announce his presence. Daniel. He was walking straight toward her, Tiffany in tow, their entrance as loud as their designer clothes. Tiffany's red heels clicked across the linoleum, her manicured fingers looped around Daniel's arm like a trophy on display. Claire's chest tightened, but she kept scanning items. She had promised herself she wouldn't flinch. "Would you look at this?" Daniel's voice rose above the low hum of chatter. "The love of my life, reduced to groceries and coupons." The words hit like stones, but Claire refused to look up. Customers turned, their curiosity piqued, their eyes bouncing between the couple and Claire. Tiffany gave a mock gasp, pressing her hand dramatically to her chest. "Oh my God, Daniel, you didn't tell me she was working here. Isn't it just tragic?" She dragged the word out, savoring it like candy. Snickers rippled through the line. Not everyone, but enough to sting. Claire forced her hands to keep moving. Bread. Beep. Pasta. Beep. The screen blinked green numbers, her lifeline in the storm. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but her chin lifted ever so slightly. If this was their performance, then she would not play the role of victim. "Paper or plastic?" she asked the customer in front of her, her voice calm. The woman hesitated, eyes flicking toward Daniel, then murmured, "Plastic." Claire bagged quickly, smoothly, her smile professional. Not brittle, not broken. Professional. But Daniel wasn't finished. "You remember the house, don't you, Claire?" he boomed suddenly, as if reminiscing for the crowd. "The dinners, the vacations? You really downgraded, didn't you?" He smirked, scanning the strangers around him for approval. From fine wine to discount soda. From marble floors to linoleum tiles. Some customers shifted uncomfortably. A man in line muttered something under his breath. A teenage boy snorted into his hoodie. And Tiffany, always the amplifier, leaned across the counter, lowering her voice to a venomous whisper that only Claire could hear. You look tired. You must be standing here all day. I don't know how you do it. I mean, I couldn't. She straightened, smiling sweetly as if she just paid Claire a compliment. For a split second, Claire's throat threatened to close. This was the nightmare she had feared since the divorce, humiliation not behind closed doors, but in the bright lights of public life. But then she remembered the quiet promise she had made in her bedroom mirror that morning. No more flinching. No more crumbling. She lifted her gaze, just briefly, and locked eyes with Tiffany. Not a glare. Not a challenge. Just a steady, unshakable look. And in that silence, Tiffany's smile faltered. Claire rang up the next customer, her hand steady, her voice even. That'll be $28.15. Daniel looked annoyed. He had wanted a scene, tears, snapping words, anything he could walk away from gloating. Instead, he was being ignored. Tiffany tugged at his arm, laughing too loudly. Come on, let's go. Don't waste your breath here. She's beneath us. Claire didn't flinch. She didn't look after them. She didn't let the mask break. Inside, yes, the sting was real. Her heart ached, her stomach twisted, and her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. But outwardly? She stood tall. She had faced her humiliation head-on and refused to break. As Daniel and Tiffany's laughter faded into the distance, Claire exhaled slowly. Her shift wasn't over, her struggles weren't over, but something inside her had shifted. They wanted her to crumble. Instead, she chose composure. Humiliation wasn't the end. It was fuel. And though the whispers lingered around her like smoke, she knew, deep down, that this wasn't the story's conclusion. It was the storm before the turn of the tide. The whispers still hung in the air when Claire straightened her back, forcing herself to focus on the customer before her. She scanned the last item, handed over the receipt with a polite smile, and pushed the bagged groceries forward. Her hands trembled slightly under the counter, but her voice remained steady. Daniel and Tiffany lingered at the end of her lane, enjoying the way heads turned. To them, every sideways glance was proof of their victory. They thought they'd reduced her to nothing more than a cautionary tale, look what happens when you lose me. But before Daniel could make another cutting remark, the sliding doors at the front of the store hissed open. A tall man in his early 50s walked in, dressed in dark jeans and a crisp button-down shirt. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His silver-streaked hair was neatly combed, his expression relaxed but alert. It took only a second for Claire to recognize him. Her breath caught. Mr. Bennett. Richard Bennett wasn't just any man, he was the billionaire owner of the entire grocery chain. Yet he always came across as approachable, almost neighborly. Claire had seen him a handful of times before. He made it a point to visit different stores unannounced, checking in on his employees, shaking hands, and asking about their families. Unlike Daniel, who measured worth in money and status, Richard measured it in character. He spotted Claire instantly. His face lit up with genuine warmth as he strode toward her lane. Claire, he said, his voice carrying across the checkout lines. Good to see you again. How are the kids? The shift in the room was palpable. Shoppers paused mid-step. Employees froze. Even the manager, who had been watching from a distance, straightened in surprise. And Daniel? His smug smile faltered. Claire blinked, momentarily caught off guard, but then returned Richard's smile. They're doing well, thank you for asking. Emma just started high school, and Jacob's playing soccer now. Richard nodded approvingly, leaning slightly against the counter like an old friend stopping by. That's wonderful. You must be proud. Out of the corner of her eye, Claire saw Tiffany's expression change. The exaggerated pity had evaporated, replaced by something far less flattering, confusion and unease. Daniel's jaw tightened. He forced a laugh, trying to salvage his dominance. You know Claire? He asked, his tone skeptical, as if Richard must have mistaken her for someone else. Richard's eyes flicked toward him, cool and sharp. Of course. Claire's one of our best. Employees like her keep this company alive. He turned back to Claire, his smile kind but serious. I've heard from your manager more than once about how dependable you are. You've been here through late nights, storms, even that power outage last winter. That kind of loyalty doesn't go unnoticed. Claire's throat tightened. The sting of Daniel's earlier mockery still lingered, but now something stronger rose to meet it, pride. The crowd around them had grown. Shoppers pretended to browse magazines while sneaking glances. A mother in line whispered something to her daughter, and the girl's eyes widened in admiration as she looked at Claire. Daniel, realizing the attention had shifted, tried again. Well, I suppose bagging groceries is important in its own way, he said, smirking at Tiffany as though they shared a private joke. But Richard didn't let it slide. His gaze snapped to Daniel, piercing and firm. Don't belittle honest work, he said, his tone carrying the weight of authority. Every position in this company matters. And frankly, Claire has shown more integrity in this store than some people show in their entire lives. Daniel's smirk disappeared. Tiffany shifted uncomfortably beside him, her arms crossed a little tighter. Claire stood straighter, her cheeks flushed, not with shame, but with gratitude. She hadn't expected a savior, hadn't needed one to define her worth, but Richard's words carved through the haze of humiliation like sunlight breaking storm clouds. The manager hurried over, eager to be part of the moment. Mr. Bennett, we're honored to have you here. Would you like me to give you a tour of the store? Richard waved him off gently. Not right now. I came to check in, but more importantly, I wanted to thank people like Claire. He glanced back at her, lowering his voice just enough for her to hear. Hard work and grace under pressure, those qualities matter. More than Daniel here would ever understand. The deliberate use of Daniel's name made heads turn. Someone in line stifled a laugh. Daniel's face reddened. Tiffany grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, but he jerked away, glaring at Claire as though she had orchestrated the entire scene. Claire met his glare with calm, steady eyes. For the first time, she wasn't the one shrinking under his shadow. Richard gave her shoulder a reassuring pat. I'll be in touch soon, Claire. I think there's more you can do for this company than just the checkout line. With that, he turned and walked toward the back office, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The silence broke quickly, soft murmurs of admiration, nods from customers who had witnessed everything. A woman in line leaned toward Claire and said softly, "Good for you." Claire exhaled slowly. The humiliation Daniel had tried to drape over her like a shroud had slipped away. In its place was something sturdier, something she'd built quietly all along, respect. Daniel tugged Tiffany toward the exit, muttering under his breath, but no one was paying attention to him anymore. The power had shifted. For once, it wasn't his narrative. It was hers. Claire returned to her register, her hands steady now. She scanned the next customer's items with ease, a small smile tugging at her lips. The tables were beginning to turn. The air inside the store still crackled with the aftershock of Richard's words. Claire's heart was steady now, no longer pounding with dread but pulsing with something she hadn't felt in years, validation. She glanced at Daniel, standing stiff and red-faced by the automatic doors, Tiffany tugging at his sleeve like she couldn't decide whether to leave or melt into the linoleum. For so long, he had been the one to dictate the script, the one who determined who looked small and who stood tall. But today, the story had slipped out of his hands. Claire rang up one more customer, her smile polite but brighter now. When she handed over the receipt, the woman leaned in slightly and whispered, "Good for you, honey." Claire felt her throat tighten, but in the best way. Just as she turned to the next customer, Richard reappeared at her side. His timing, as always, was impeccable. "Claire," he said warmly, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard by those still pretending to browse the candy aisle, "I don't want to take up too much of your time while you're on the clock, but I'd like to extend a personal invitation." Claire blinked. "An invitation?" "Yes," Richard said, his smile kind but deliberate. "I'm hosting a charity dinner this weekend, scholarships for underprivileged kids. I'd like you to be there." He tilted his head, lowering his tone slightly. "You've given this company more than your fair share. It's time others saw what I've already seen." A hush fell across the checkout lanes. Even the manager, standing a few feet away, looked as though he'd just swallowed his tongue. Richard straightened. "Actually, why wait? You've done enough for today. Clock out early. My driver's waiting outside with the Bentley, I'll have him take you home. We can go over the details for the dinner on the way." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Daniel's head snapped up. Tiffany gasped audibly. A Bentley? A charity dinner? This wasn't the script they had rehearsed in their heads, where Claire would shrink under ridicule and they would stride away victorious. No, this was a rewrite, and Claire was suddenly the heroine. Claire's lips parted, caught between shock and protest. "Mr. Bennett, I don't want to cause a scene." Richard chuckled softly, waving a dismissive hand. "Nonsense. You've more than earned this. Let them see what respect looks like." The manager, scrambling to appear agreeable, hurried forward. Of course, Claire, please take the evening off. We'll manage here." Claire hesitated only a moment longer, then nodded. "All right. Thank you, sir." Richard offered his arm like a gentleman escorting royalty. "Allow me." And just like that, Claire stepped out from behind the register. Every eye in the store followed as she walked beside him, shoulders squared, head high. Not a whisper of shame clung to her now. Daniel and Tiffany tried to pretend they weren't watching, but their expressions betrayed them. Tiffany's painted smile had collapsed into a thin, bitter line. Daniel's jaw was clenched so tight a vein pulsed at his temple. His hand curled around his keys as if gripping them might somehow anchor him in this moment he was losing control of. The automatic doors slid open, and the late afternoon sunlight spilled in. Parked at the curb was a sleek black Bentley, its chrome details gleaming like liquid silver. The driver, dressed in a sharp uniform, stood ready. Richard gestured toward the car with easy authority. "Here we are." Gasps rippled through the crowd gathered just inside the entrance. Someone whispered, "That's his car," and another shopper craned their neck for a better view. Richard stepped ahead, opened the rear door himself, and turned back to Claire. "After you." For a heartbeat, Claire froze. She thought of every cutting remark Daniel had made, every smirk Tiffany had worn like a badge of triumph, every moment she had bitten back tears and reminded herself to keep going for the kids' sake. And now, here she was, being ushered into a billionaire's limousine while the people who had mocked her watched in silence. She drew in a breath, lifted her chin, and stepped gracefully into the car. The effect was instantaneous. Daniel's composure shattered. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, too loud, his voice cracking. "She's just Claire." But no one was listening. Richard closed the door with a firm click, then glanced back at the store. His eyes brushed over Daniel and Tiffany without acknowledgement, the way one might ignore a pair of flies buzzing near the trash. With a polite nod to the gawking crowd, Richard circled the car and slid into the other side. The driver shut the door, rounded the front, and in moments the Bentley purred to life, gliding away from the curb with smooth, effortless power. Inside, Claire exhaled, a small laugh escaping her lips. Not mocking, not triumphant, just disbelieving at how quickly the day had turned. Richard looked at her with a gentle smile. "Don't be surprised, Claire. People like Daniel think wealth defines value. But I know better. Character does. And you've had that all along." Her eyes stung, but she blinked back the tears. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about finally being seen for who she truly was. Back at the storefront, Daniel and Tiffany stood frozen, watching the Bentley disappear into the distance. For the first time, their smug laughter was gone. All that remained was shock, envy, and the bitter taste of a reversal they hadn't seen coming. Claire hadn't needed to humiliate them. Life had done it for her. And for the first time in a long time, she walked into her future with dignity, not shame. The mocked ex-wife was mocked no more. The Bentley rolled smoothly through the city streets, the tinted windows muting the world outside. Inside, Claire sat in quiet awe, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She had spent years riding buses, juggling grocery bags, and praying the tank in her beat-up car wouldn't hit empty before payday. Now here she was, seated in the back of a billionaire's limousine, invited not as someone to serve, but as someone to be honored. Richard glanced at her, reading her silence with a practiced ease. "You belong in rooms where people respect what you bring to the table, Claire. Not just as an employee, but as a woman who's carried more than her share." Claire smiled faintly, her voice soft. "I've spent so long trying to convince myself I wasn't invisible. Daniel always made me feel like nothing." Richard's gaze was steady. "Then let tonight be the reminder you've always deserved, you are not nothing. You are more than enough." Those words sank deep into her chest. For years, Claire had lived in Daniel's shadow, defined by his contempt. But with each mile the Bentley carried her away, she felt the weight of that shadow fading. 2 nights later, the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel glittered with chandeliers and polished marble floors. Tables draped in white linen lined the room, while crystal glasses caught the warm light like prisms. This was Richard Bennett's charity dinner, an annual event that drew CEOs, philanthropists, and politicians alike. Claire stood near the entrance, dressed in a floor-length navy gown Richard's assistant had helped her pick. The fabric hugged her frame modestly yet elegantly, her hair swept into soft waves that framed her face. Pearl earrings, the same ones she'd worn even on her grocery shifts, glimmered faintly, now perfectly at home in this world of refinement. When she walked into the room, heads turned. Not because she was loud, not because she demanded attention, but because dignity radiated from her like quiet light. Richard introduced her warmly to his colleagues. "This is Claire," he told a group of executives. "She's the kind of person this company is built on, hardworking, dedicated, and stronger than most I know." Claire shook hands, exchanged polite smiles, and for the first time in years, felt her worth recognized without qualification. And then, like a bad echo from a past life, she saw him. Daniel. Standing at the far side of the ballroom, uncomfortable in a rented tuxedo, Tiffany clinging to his arm in a sequin dress that tried too hard. They hadn't been invited by Richard, that much was clear, they were hangers-on, guests of someone else with influence. But they were here nonetheless, and their eyes found Claire instantly. Tiffany's face hardened. Daniel's jaw slackened. Claire felt her heart flutter, but not with fear this time. No, this was different. She didn't shrink. She didn't hide. She simply stood straighter, allowing the truth of her presence to speak louder than words. Richard, catching the direction of her gaze, leaned in slightly. "You don't need to worry about them tonight. They're not the story anymore, you are." Later, as the evening unfolded, Richard took the stage. The room fell silent as he addressed the crowd about education, opportunity, and lifting people up rather than tearing them down. Then, with deliberate grace, he gestured toward where Claire sat. "There's someone in this room who embodies what we're here for," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly. "Claire has given years of service in our stores, holding her head high through challenges most of us couldn't imagine. She reminds us that true strength doesn't come from wealth or power, it comes from perseverance." The spotlight shifted, illuminating her table. Claire froze, every eye in the room landing on her. Richard smiled warmly. "Stand, Claire. Let them see the kind of woman who keeps this company alive." Her legs trembled as she rose, but once standing, she felt a surge of calm. Applause erupted, genuine, thundering applause. People nodded toward her with respect, admiration flickering in their eyes. Across the room, Daniel's face flushed deep crimson. Tiffany whispered something sharp in his ear, but he didn't respond. His hands gripped the tablecloth, knuckles white, as if willing the scene to dissolve. But it didn't. Because this time, Claire wasn't the woman cowering in the checkout line while he mocked her. She was the woman being honored by a billionaire, her dignity undeniable, her strength finally visible to all. When she sat back down, Richard leaned over, his voice low. "How does it feel?" Claire exhaled, her smile soft but firm. "Like I finally let go of a weight I never should have carried." The night flowed on, filled with laughter, conversation, and the hum of success. And through it all, Claire never once looked back at Daniel again. When the evening ended, Richard's Bentley was waiting once more. The driver opened the door, and Richard offered his hand, just as he had days before. This time, Claire didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his and stepped inside with the grace of someone who had finally learned her worth. As the car pulled away, Daniel and Tiffany stood on the curb, their expressions a mix of jealousy and disbelief. But Claire didn't see them. She wasn't living in their story anymore. Her story had changed. She had been humiliated, mocked, dismissed. But she had risen, carried not by revenge but by the quiet dignity that had always been hers. The ex-wife they tried to belittle had become the woman everyone else admired. And for the first time, as the city lights blurred past the windows, Claire smiled with a certainty that filled her entire being. She had finally reclaimed her life. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, it helps more people find stories of strength and redemption. Comment below, do you think Daniel ever truly realized what he lost? Subscribe now for more powerful stories of betrayal, resilience, and poetic justice. You won't want to miss the next twist.